We are going to get started because we have to be out of here at 8 o'clock on the dot. I just want to, hello. Oh my God. I'm really going to have to build. Hello. Clap once if you can hear me. Clap twice if you can hear me. Okay, so man, the kindergarten thing really works. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. 1, 2, eyes on. Yeah, all right. Well, I'd like to welcome you all on a glorious Friday night when the Warriors are playing in Game 4 of the NBA Finals. Thank you for all of your sacrifice. Oh my goodness. Well, what better thing than to come out and spend your Friday evening with 300 people to listen about housing. So my name is Elaine Wong. I'm a co-founder and I'm the current president of the board of directors, I suppose that's my title, of the group called Palo Alto Forward. And this is a very exciting time and very contentious time. But it's great to see so many faces here to visit with State Senator Scott Wiener. And so I would like to invite all of Scott up here. Scott? And then I would also like to invite, this event really could not have happened without all of our glorious co-sponsors. Okay, come on up guys, everybody. Yeah. Hello. Oh, that's much better. All right. So, oh my gosh, now I don't have my notes. Well, I wanted to just thank you all again, and I really just wanted to underscore how much effort has gone into this event, and it really could not have been possible without all of the co-sponsors who participated in this. And so, whoa, we're all kind of mixed up, but this is your crew here who brought to you, everything here is brought to you by Scott, but brought to you by everybody here. And so I just wanted to give them acknowledgement and thanks. First we have TechEquity Collaborative, Fahad Qureshi and Herman, is Herman here, Calderon? Oh, he's valiantly manning the entry table. We have Steve Levy here from the League of Women Voters Housing and Transportation Committee. Gina Dalma. Oh. Yay, Steve. We have Gina Dalma from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. Thank you for being here and thank you for sponsoring. Mitch Mencken and Michael Lane from Silicon Valley at Home. And we also have, oh my gosh, Angie Evans from San Mateo County Housing Leadership Council. That's the San Mateo group. SV at Home is Santa Clara County, is that right? And Kelsey Baines, Jordan Grimes, and Adina Levin from Peninsula for Everyone. I think a lot of you have heard about something called the housing crisis, and there are a lot of different groups who have been really interested, connecting and working together just to see if we can have dialogue and find solutions. So thank you very much, co-sponsors, for really making this event happen. Michael, thank you. Okay. Thank you, guys. So before we get started, I also just wanted to, where do you like to stand? Would you like to stand? Okay, I'm going to give the floor to Scott in just a couple minutes. But I do want to just kind of acknowledge there's a couple of other elected officials who are in the room. Is Mark Berman here? Mark? There he is, State Assembly AD 24. I think, do we have a couple maybe one council member? Ooh, oh, yeah, Adrian Fine. And you've got a hand here. Oh, thank you for being here. And Menlo Park Council member, thank you for being here. And any other thank you. I mean, these are we've got regional problems. They all require dialogue, and it's really great to see a number of different faces here. Before we get started, just a couple of little housekeeping rules. If you need to use the restroom, They're out in the hallway on the back over here. I do want to just underscore that we would really like to encourage that everyone set an environment where we can all learn and listen from each other. And so I hope you all listen actively. Let's be respectful, and no applause or boos. You know, and I know we've got lots of good feelings on across the spectrum, but it would be great if we can just kind of leave kind of our emotions at the table and just kind of listen carefully and respectfully, and just let's just make it a comfortable environment for us to kind of all get along. Oh, we've got one more elected who just walked in the door. Hi, Liz Niss from Palo Alto. Thank you for being here. Okay, and then just quick note on format. We're gonna hear from Scott for about 20 minutes, and we do have to keep the timer because we gotta get out of this room at 8 o'clock. Then we'll have 10 minutes of a little preliminary Q&A. You'll all notice that underneath on your seats there were index cards. Those index cards are for questions. If you have a question, please fill out the question card. There are people on the sides who will be collecting them. I think Fahad in the TechEquity shirt, and then a couple of other folks. If you're collecting cards, raise your hand real quick. Okay, Sandra in the back. Please give your cards to the question card folks, and we'll bring them up for Scott to answer. And please ask a question in the question card. That's always helpful. Statements may or may not get read. And we want to use the most of our time here with Scott tonight. And then after a few minutes of question and answer, we'd like to give you all the opportunity to interact with each other, interact with Scott, interact with any of the other groups in the room, and hopefully we'll be out of here at 8 on the dot. And so you can enjoy your summer night. And I've also had another request. Please don't tell us the outcome of the Warriors game. I know some of you might be streaming it. I know we're all excited, but let's hold that for later. So without further ado, we're going to have State Senator Scott Wiener. Just a quick introduction. You represent San Francisco and Northern San Mateo County. You were elected in 2016, and man, he's been prolific. 26 bills passed in legislature, focusing on housing, transportation, civil rights, criminal justice, clean energy, alleviating poverty. He is the chair of the Senate Housing Committee. And before he was elected to the Senate, he was the chair of the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. Representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk, the Castro. Is that right? Before he came into office, he practiced law in San Francisco for 15 years, including a decade at the Deputy City District Attorney's Office. And, oh my, okay. And he's served on a number of community leadership roles, including the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and the Board of Directors for the Human Rights Campaign. I really just, appreciate all the breadth and the depth of issues that you've been working on. I think it's really just a testament to, your efforts and your ability to think intersectionally, and that supports your work. So. He's been a resident of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997. How is that, 22 years already? Holy cow. And he graduated from Duke University and Harvard Law School. So I'm going to turn this over to Scott, but may I ask a favor? Could you start by maybe explaining a little bit of why you got interested and involved in housing? Okay.
Does this work? Okay. It's not too loud or too... Is that good? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am... back here? Yeah. Okay, there we go. Thank you for having me here tonight. And first of all, as soon as I learned that the Warriors were playing tonight, I assumed there would be 5 people here. So I'm honored that you're here, but you're not here because of me, you're here because of housing. And because in many ways, this is, maybe along with the wildfires, is the defining issue of what California is going to be in the future. And before I start, I want to really thank you for electing 2 amazing colleagues of mine, Assemblymember Berman and Senator Jerry Hill. putting aside what, whether you agree or disagree with people on different issues, it makes all the difference in the world when you have colleagues who are really are mature and sophisticated and thoughtful and get it. And Mark and Jerry really fit that category to a T. It's amazing to work with both of them. They represent you well, and I'm really sad that Jerry Hill's going to be turned out next year because he and I, as senators, work hand in glove in neighboring districts. So again, thank you for sending these two amazing representatives. So you heard the question, why do I do this work in housing where there were no picketers outside tonight. I've been picketed in various parts of the state, and that's okay. It's the First Amendment. People can express themselves in whatever way they want. It's a hard area to work in because it brings out very strong passions wherever people are on any particular issue. But I do this work because I do think that it is going to determine the future of the state. And as you heard, I moved to San Francisco in 1997 as a 27-year-old for the same reason that generations of LGBT people have moved to the Bay Area and to San Francisco to find their communities and make lives for ourselves. And I will never forget, I landed in San Francisco on a Friday. I gave myself 2 weeks to find a place to live and get settled. This was the beginning of the .com boom. And I figured it would be the same as in Philadelphia and Massachusetts. I would just go out, you just find the place you like, you sign a lease, and it's like super easy. Well, Saturday morning, I go out to my first open house. It was actually in the Haight. And I walk up and there's a line down the block and around the corner to get into that open house. And it was like that over and over and over again. And I remember saying to myself, what on earth is going on here? And I didn't understand anything about housing in San Francisco or California at that time. I just knew that this was not a great situation. I was lucky, I found the place. Some people probably wish I hadn't found the place and had gone back to the East Coast. They tell me that from time to time. But I did find the place in the Castro. And then I was practicing as a lawyer at a downtown law firm before I went to the city attorney's office. But this firm was one of those really old school firms where you did a ton of pro bono work. And the pro bono work that I primarily did was to defend low-income renters who were facing eviction. And so I handled a number of those cases. And they were just heartbreaking. These were people primarily older, a lot of long-term HIV survivors, people who had been in the community for decades, who were facing eviction, not for anything they had done, owner move-in evictions, Ellis Act evictions, and would make statements to me like, I moved here when I was 20, I'm now 60, and if I am evicted, I have to leave San Francisco. Or I'm gonna have to leave San Francisco to afford housing, and so but my HIV care won't be as good as it is here. Those kinds of stories over and over again. So I had my own personal experience that I lucked out, got a place, then seeing the damage that this was doing. And then I got involved in my neighborhood. And over time, I was on my neighborhood association board, and I was the president of the neighborhood association. And my neighborhood was not an anti-housing or anti-development neighborhood. It was a place where developers and development would be welcome. But even with that kind of positive attitude about doing this development, we would see projects come through that were 100% within zoning. One in particular I remember had 50 community meetings for a project that was 100% within the zoning. And it took, I think, 3 years to get entitled. And I remember thinking to myself, again, why is this happening? They're not asking for any exceptions to anything. Why is this happening? And so from all these different angles, I started to just see the dysfunction in the system, that it's hard to find the place to live, that people are getting evicted and kicked out and can't afford to stay here, and that you have this process where it takes years and years to approve even something that was within zoning. I then was elected to the Board of Supervisors in 2010, took office January 2011, and we were in just barely coming out of the recession, 10% unemployment, huge deficit. Housing was at least more stable at that point. But then I was there for a 6-year period from 2011 to 2016 when just all hell broke loose around housing. And a bad housing situation just exploded. And we were seeing displacement like we had never seen before. rents just going through the roof, not just in San Francisco, but throughout the Bay Area, and then all of the explosive fights around tech and the Google shuttles and Airbnb and everything else. And to the point where I remember one day walking down the street, it must have been 2015 or thereabouts, on the Board of Supervisors, and one of my neighbors in the Castro, an older gentleman, walks up to me and he said, "Scott, I'm afraid." And I said, "Why are you afraid?" He said, "Because my landlord is painting my building." Now, normally you'd think that'd be a good thing, but he, of course, immediately jumped to, he's getting ready to sell the place, I'm going to be kicked out, and I'm going to have to leave San Francisco. So, I say these things just so people understand, this wasn't like for someone like me, you land in Sacramento and say, I'm going to, fight this housing fight. This is about real people who are being harmed in very profound ways. Prevailing wage and setbacks and design standards, and so terms that people don't even always know what they mean. But to people in California, they may not know what those terms mean, but what they do know is that their kid has a classmate in 5th grade who sleeps in a homeless shelter every night or in a car, because 1 in 20 school children in California, and it's probably an undercount, is homeless. 1 in 20 school children in California. They know that they had a young family living down the street who had a second kid and couldn't find any housing appropriate for a growing family, and is now living either 2 hours away where they're commuting 4 hours a day, or maybe living in Denver or Austin or Boise, Idaho. They know that there are people living in tents down the street. They know that their kid just graduated college and wants to move back with what's going on with housing today in California. And people know that they want change. And I know that I've had colleagues that have come up to me in the legislature and said, "Your bill, SB 50, everyone in my district hates it. Everyone hates your bill." And I've always said to them, you know what, that's not true. I'm sure there are people who hate it, but there are plenty of people who like it, and you're not hearing from them because opposition motivates people, unfortunately, to be vocal more so than support at times. And lo and behold, in the last month, 3 different statewide polls have come out showing 66% support for SB 50, 61%, and 62%. The last one showed over 60% support in every single region of the state, 70% support among renters, 51% among homeowners, which is people view as the toughest demographic. Majority support in people over 55. I'm at 49, so I'm going to be there shortly. So people, the broad population of California understands that the system's broken and that it needs to be different. They understand that you can have single-family homes and apartment buildings in the same neighborhood and everything's going to be okay. So where shortage of the other 49 states combined. So 1/2 of the United States housing shortage is in one state, California. We rank 49, and by the way, the only critique I've ever heard of that 3.5 million number is people who argue that it's actually 2.5 million. Literally, that's the only critique I've heard. We rank 49 out of the 50 states in homes per capita. Only Utah is lower than us because they have larger household sizes. And it's just getting worse. In the early 1960s, when we were a state of 15 million people, we used to build 250,000 to 330,000 units of housing a year. Today, we're a state of 40 million people, and we build last year 77,000 units, and it's going down every year. We're not even going up. So housing is explosively expensive in California, leading to all of the problems that we see. And so how did we get to the point of doing this? I like to refer to it as California's housing last policy. It's a de facto policy that it is not a priority to have enough housing for everyone, and that things like views and light and air and parking and traffic and so forth, everything else is more important than whether people have a place to live. I think it was not an intentional policy choice, but I think it was layered upon layer of choices made over the last 50 years that got us to this de facto policy. We, in what we view as single-family neighborhoods today that have apartment buildings that were built in the 1920s and 30s, 40s, 50s, they're everywhere. And then they were banned, and we decided in 75% of California, we made it illegal to build anything other than a single-family home. So when we talk about single-family home zoning, it's important to really acknowledge what that is. It's a ban on every other form of housing. And I'm not against single-family homes. I grew up in one. I think they're great. It's not about getting rid of single-family homes. It's about saying that in addition to single-family homes, we also need multi-unit buildings. They both serve an important purpose. So in San Francisco, in 75% of our land mass, it's illegal to build anything other than single-family or two-unit. Same with Los Angeles, and same with places all over California. So when you talk about filling in that 3.5 million home gap that we have and not being 49 out of 50 states in homes per capita, where are we going to put that housing, right? Are we going to build it where the jobs are, where the transit is, or are we just going to keep sprawling out and covering up farmland and clogging up our freeways and so forth, and creating a new generation of super commuters, of people who are commuting in to the Bay Area from Manteca or Modesto or Stockton, or let's do it where it's sustainable. And then even where we have zones for sufficient housing, we make it remarkably hard to actually build that housing. And we do it through the process that we put people through. It's a combination. It's not just a city thing. It's the city and the state partnering together to make it really hard to approve housing. Through local discretionary process where you can appeal until the end of time, and through interpretations of CEQA that have made it exceptionally easy to recently withdrawn from funding affordable housing. The state, until recently, was providing very, very little funding for subsidized housing for low-income people. The state took away redevelopment, which was the most powerful tool that cities had to fund low-income housing, and didn't replace it with anything. And of course, the federal government has been missing in action on housing for a long time. And then the state has failed to protect renters. And so the vast majority of renters, which is I believe 40% of our population, have little or no protections from having their rent tripled or quadrupled overnight or being kicked out of their place on 60 days notice. So the state has failed. Our state government has failed. And this isn't about blaming cities. City council members have one of the hardest jobs on the planet and go to work every day. We expect them to just go to work and approve housing and risk their own political futures. The state we have not set up a system that is designed to facilitate having enough housing. In fact, we have a system that is designed to not produce enough housing. And that's what this work is about. That's what we're doing in the legislature. And it is a very difficult and tense conversation to say, you know what, we know we've done it this way for a long time. We've had a system of pure local control where cities can do whatever they want on housing. No housing, a little housing, a lot of housing, no affordable housing, only single family homes, no multi-unit. We've allowed cities to essentially have complete latitude to make those choices, and respectfully, it hasn't worked. I'm a former local elected official. I believe in local control, and I think overwhelmingly local control, local decision making leads to better results, but not always. And local control is not biblical. Local control is a good thing when it leads to good results, and I would say that our system of pure local control in housing has not led to good results. So what we're trying to do is just do a rebalancing, not to eliminate local control. And SB 50 doesn't eliminate local control, but just to set some basic baseline state standards to say we have this huge housing shortage. This is a statewide concern. It's affecting our economy. It's affecting our climate goals as we force people into longer commutes. There are small businesses that can't even hire people. They can't hire a stable workforce, so they're shutting down because of the cost of housing. Nonprofits that are struggling, and so on and so forth. We need to address this collectively and have some basic rules in place. So that's what this discussion, I don't want to call it a fight, discussion is about. So what is happening in the legislature? And I think it's been a lot of good work. And it's not just, it started before Mark and I got there at the end of 2016. First, the legislature has been putting teeth into long existing laws that have essentially been dead letters. In the early 1980s, the state of California passed a law saying cities must allow people to put ADUs or in-law units in their homes. That's been a requirement since I think it's 82 or sometime in the early 80s. And for decades, it was a dead letter, including in Palo Alto and San Francisco, and cities were just obstructing it. Well, in the last 3 or 4 years, the legislature has put teeth into that law. And lo and behold, even though there's still some resistance, we're seeing more and more ADUs being built, and that's a good thing. In the early 1980s, the state passed, you can't chop off the top story if you zone for it. You can't say no if you've zoned for it. And that also was a dead letter for a long time. In the last few years, the legislature has put teeth into that law and said you can sue if the Housing Accountability Act is violated. The state for many years has had an affordable housing density bonus program where if you do a certain level of affordability, you get more density. You get to less parking, more height, and so forth. That was ignored for many years. It's now finally being implemented and is increasing production of housing overall and affordable housing in particular. So that's one thing that we've been doing, just strengthening the existing laws that have been ignored for a long time. Then in 2017, we passed a number of laws, including Senate Bill 35 that I authored to streamline housing approvals in cities that are not meeting their housing goals under the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, and as well as some laws to close loopholes in the housing element process and so forth. And last year, we started to reform RHNA because the way we set these housing goals, California, it is a broken process. Where it tends to be that wealthier cities push their obligations into less powerful cities. So the most egregious example is the city of Beverly Hills has a RHNA housing allocation for an 8-year period of exactly 2 units. 2 units. They've exceeded it. They exceeded their RHNA. So they're actually, Beverly Hills is on a short list of cities that completely meets its RHNA. And so we see examples like that around the state, so we're trying to fix RHNA. Thank you. And even though I'm of the view that the only way we're going to structurally fix housing in California is to build a lot more housing to try to stabilize the situation. We know that for low-income people, the market used to produce housing affordable to low-income people in many places. That's not happening anymore, and I don't know when it's going to happen again. And so we have to provide stronger housing subsidies. Proposed this year, the state is finally re-entering the business of helping cities build affordable low-income housing. We have a big push to try to bring back a form of redevelopment of tax increment financing focused on affordable housing and infrastructure. We need to give cities that tool back, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that. Another thing that we're finally getting more traction on is protecting renters. For many, many years, it was almost impossible to just pass a rent cap bill. And again, there were compromises made, it was scaled back. Some people have criticized that. I don't criticize that. That kind of bill would have been dead in its first committee 5 years ago. But the crisis is so bad that there's now action. And a bill that died to require just cause for renters in the Senate, it died with 20 votes. So it was only 1 vote short. A few years ago, it wouldn't have probably even gotten 10 votes on the floor of the Senate. So we're seeing not complete success, but progress in trying to protect renters, and that's a sea change in the California legislature. And then we're trying to do zoning reform. And as I mentioned, we have this challenge with 75% of the land in California where we banned allowed to build is 1 unit per parcel. The math doesn't work. It is undermining, that zoning is directly undermining our climate goals. It's directly leading to people commuting 2 hours, except for the fourplex, which are by right. So for the most part, people will still have to go to the Planning Commission or whatever the local rules are. So an enormous amount of local decision making, including largely around heights and bulk, still apply under the bill. And in terms of phasing, you know, I'm sure through negotiations there will be that will be a topic of discussion about when should the bill kick in. We don't want to wait too long because we have a crisis now, but we, you know, will of course always work on implementation.
I have a couple similar question, but is it possible to spend legislative efforts helping more depressed areas of California and allow them to grow as opposed to, you know, I guess working on areas where, you know, working in areas where there isn't as much housing and allowing the housing to kind of be pushed there? You know, why not focus efforts there as opposed to in Philly?
Well, I mean, I think historically in California, that's sort of what happened. It's whichever area is sort of, you know, more, has less economic power and can't sort of stick up for itself as much, we say we'll put the housing there. And they need housing too, so I'm not opposed. We need housing everywhere. But I think wealthier areas also need housing. And when you look at like San Francisco, where and I sometimes pick a little bit on Beverly Hills because their mayor is really low over the top sometimes in his rhetoric. So I sort of poke fun at Beverly Hills a little bit. But I actually hold my own city of San Francisco. The city I criticize the most is my own city of San Francisco, where 70% of the land bans apartment buildings. And we need housing where the jobs are and where the transit is. And so whether it's a wealthy area like, you know, Noe Valley, which I used to represent on the Board of Supervisors and still represent, or Pacific Heights. But I think that we have to focus also on sustainability. And, you know, as the governor says, and I agree, as we need these 3.5 million homes. And if we don't
So, thanks. I guess we'll hold applause for a little bit. One interesting question. Would you be willing to
Now, the only threshold we have is RHNA, and as I mentioned before, RHNA is completely broken. The city of Cupertino, which has welcomed endless Apple expansions, but not very much housing, technically meets its market rate RHNA, which is, you know, I think, sort of an example of why the system is. Both sides are guilty of it, including people who are allied with me on this issue and people opposing me. This notion that housing is a punishment, that the bad and naughty cities should get the housing, and the good actor cities should get a pass, right? And so you hear that from people saying, I don't want more housing in my community, we're trying really hard, why are you punishing me? And then you hear it from supporters of SB 50 who will be like, we need to stick it to the cities that are really, you know, acting really badly and refusing to build housing. Housing is not a punishment, in my view. Housing is a good thing. It is one of the fundamental building blocks of life, along with like water and air and food and childbirth. Like, it's one of the things that everyone needs. And so housing, you know, it's transit. I just think it's the wrong metric to look at. It's just my view.
You mentioned transit. You know, how do we achieve better transit? I think this is the flip side of the housing argument. And, you know, oftentimes, oh, you can't do housing because there's no transportation or infrastructure. Yeah. How do we bring the infrastructure to support that, including transportation?
We need to do a few things. If I can get a little bit political, I'm not in the Capitol, so I can be a little political here. Sorry if I offend everyone. We need to get rid of this president, and we need to get rid of Mitch McConnell. We need to have a federal government that actually wants to fund infrastructure and transportation. And the fact that we spend, when you compare us to like Europe or any other part of the world, to India, to Turkey, we spend so much less in terms of percentage of GDP that we spend on rail than countries that are much poorer than we are. Or India. We spend so little on rail, and that has to turn around. We need massive federal investment. Instead, the federal gas tax, which hasn't been raised even for inflation in 25 years. 80% of it goes to roads and freeways, 20% to transit, and the Republicans every few years try to get rid of that 20%. Right? So we need to do so much more at the federal level to invest in transit. The state also has to do more. We make it really hard to generate revenue in California. We make it hard at the state level. We make it really hard for cities to actually fund basic services through the way we've set up our tax structure. So we need absolute massive investment in transit. And we don't have a statewide rail system, a true statewide rail system in California. And no offense to Amtrak, it's a wonderful, wonderful system if you're want to just sort of see the countryside and but the reality is to get from San Francisco to LA or from the East Bay to LA on transit on Amtrak, it takes twice as long as driving. And so we need. I know I don't want to get into a high-speed rail debate. I know that's like red meat in certain parts of the peninsula. I'm a strong supporter of high-speed rail because it's not even about high-speed. It's about having a real rail system because we can't keep expanding the highways. Even if we wanted to, that's unbelievably expensive also. But if you fly a lot internally in California, the short-haul flights are starting to get squeezed out in California because we don't have the airport space. We can't keep expanding our airports, and long-haul flights are going to always be prioritized over flights within the state. So we're facing a real, even bigger transportation problem in this state unless we get it together and have true statewide rail system, and I'm all for that. And one of my colleagues got recalled in Orange County a year ago because he had the guts to join us to cast a 2/3 vote to raise the gas tax and vehicle registration fees to pay for transit and for roads. So it's really, really, really hard, but we have to do it.
Kind of following up on this tax issue, we've got a question about reforming the tax code. Do you support reforming the California tax code for opportunity zone lands?
The reform Prop 13 here, all the city council members in here, that housing is not usually profitable for cities. It's much more profitable to do commercial development, hotels, et cetera, because you get different kinds of taxes, and from homes, you get capped property taxes only. And so it's a really hard conversation, but our tax system undermines both schools and housing in California.
You mentioned Prop 13, and I think there's been a couple of allusions to Prop 13 having some unintended consequences. Reform is one thing, but most legislation, I guess, has unintended consequences. I kind of want to put this back to you. Do you foresee any unintended consequences with some of the housing legislation that's been proposed?
Well, the good thing about passing legislation in the legislature is if there are unintended consequences, you can fix it in the legislature. And there's a million examples if you pass a law and then a few years later, someone said, wait, I don't think we intended this and it's doing this, and then you introduce another bill and you fix it. The challenge with ballot measures and constitutional amendments is it goes to a vote of 40 million people, and it's really hard to change anything after the fact. And so that's why some people say on housing, go to the ballot on it, go do a ballot measure. And I'm hoping it never gets there because I think it's something we can and should handle in the legislature and then be able to roll with the punches and make changes or tweak things as needed going forward.
Yeah. So kind of on that, I think there's a couple questions about, I guess, the process of the legislature. Speaking of the legislative process, so maybe could you explain some of the Senate rules and whether or not they should be changed potentially? There's a sort of a disbelief. How can one senator kill, or not kill, but delay the SB 50 vote? And maybe just a couple of things about what is next.
I have many, many opinions about the process in the Senate and the Assembly, and I could go on for hours about if I were the king of the Senate, what I would do to change, king of not on policy, but on just the way we operate. There are a lot of things that I would like to change. But I do think our process, any bill has to go usually between the two houses, has to travel through somewhere between 2 and 8 committees. And often it's about 4 to 6. And any one of those committees can hack apart your bill, can whittle it down to nothing, can mangle it into something that does something different than what you intended, or kill your bill. And so it is really like, if you think about, if you ever see a documentary about like the sea turtle, mother comes out of the sea, goes up into the hills, and lays a ton of eggs, and then they hatch, whatever, a month later, and all these like 1,000 little baby turtles come out, and they have to make their way down to the ocean. And to get down to the ocean, you have to printing your bills through the process. And now it's very frustrating as an author, because there are times when you have to deal, you're like, why is this happening to my bill? This is irrational. And so it's very frequent that you have to go back the next year and fix your bill because someone did something bad to it. But I think the reason why it's so hard, it's understandable. This is a state of 40 million people. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. And when you do legislation, it affects not just a lot of people, but a lot of economic activity. And so it's understandable why we make it hard and complicated to get big things done, as frustrating as it is. But what I find is that it's rare that you can do something huge in 1 year. You can do 12 years in one house. That was a game changer, because now we can go back to the way it used to be, where you could actually gain expertise in the institution and in subject areas, and you can spend 12 years trying to reform, a few areas that you're passionate about and become an expert, or maybe chair a committee where you actually know as much or more than the staff, because with short-term limits, it's the staff and the lobbyists who know everything. You as a member know very little. I think we have at least reformed the institution to make it more possible to make real change.
Great. You mentioned Cupertino earlier, and I don't know if this is an allusion to it, but there's
So, okay, so let's talk about tech. And I hear this, it's not just here, but in San Francisco. Here's something that tech caused this problem, tech needs to solve it. And I think it's important to, I personally think that we all cause this problem, right? Tech didn't create the land use rules. Tech didn't ban apartment buildings in 75% of California. Tech never said it should take 5 years or 10 years to approve a project. Tech didn't do any of those things. We did those things, not we necessarily, well, some of us maybe, but over 50 years, we as a community made these collective decisions to underfund transit, to underfund affordable housing, to not build enough housing, to make it hard to build housing. So yes, of course, tech or any employers, the corporate community has a role to play, but we all have a role to play together. And Facebook and Apple and Google, they can't just magically approve their own housing, right? So when we say, okay, we've made it really hard for any developer to build housing, but you know what? Facebook should build its own housing for its own employees. Well, Facebook has to go through the same good thing, and companies should be both the landlord and the boss. I think that's, if people want to do it, that's fine. I don't think it's necessarily what most people want. Even if you agree with that, why, like we have companies that build housing, it's called developers, and so whoever's building it, we just need the housing. And Facebook is building housing now. I know Facebook is, 1,000, 1,500 units in Menlo Park. And I'm assuming that I think they partnered with a developer to do that. There's now a proposed moratorium that I think would undermine that project. But however we're going to build it, we just need it. And people need to pay their taxes. And it's not okay that in this country right now, a lot of these companies are paying no taxes. And because that tax money can go to infrastructure and affordable housing and everything else that we need. And there was a list that came out because of that wretched tax bill that Congress and the president passed last year, companies that are paying no federal taxes. And that's not okay. Everyone has to be part of a solution.
So just kind of changing a little bit, this is a little bit more of a philosophical question. You talked earlier about rebalancing between, pure local control and kind of legislative control. Is it better to try to change things, in our cities, building by building, or maybe expand the energy at the state level? What is the right sort of like mix and balance?
I think it's both, and I don't want to. I'm not looking to have the state of California become the planning commission for the whole state. That's not what this is about. I think the state's role here is to set general rules and boundaries, just like we do for public education. If I were to come in here and say, I have new legislation I'm proposing and I want you to support it, and this bill, it's a local control bill because local control is the best way. And so this bill, it's about education. It'll say that school boards can decide how many days a year they educate their kids. If they want to do 50, 30, 100, it's up to them. They can decide whether to hire credentialed teachers, or because maybe they want to save money and hire non-credentialed teachers, and they don't have to teach math and science unless they want to. Because these school boards, they know their communities better than the legislature, so that's local control. You would laugh me out of the room if I said that, because public education is so fundamental that we set standards. Now, we can debate what those standards should be at the state level, but I think most people agree you should have baseline standards. Well, the same is true for housing, and housing is just as important as public education, just as important for the future of the state. And so I think the state should be setting these general boundaries, and then the local control and decision making is within those boundaries to say, okay, we're going to decide how to plan our community, but there are limits to what we can do. We can't just do anything we want. There are limits. So I think it's a hard balance to strike. And I'm not saying that any one of us has the perfect answer, and it's going to be a work in progress over time. But I do know that the system we've had in California of having almost complete and total local control, unfortunately, I wish it would work. I really, really do. As someone who's spent a lot of time working at a neighborhood and city level, it hasn't worked. And so we need to recalibrate.
Kind of a follow-up question. You mentioned school boards. Here's a question about schools. If we build a lot of housing and it triples the number of families, in a given community, doubles, triples, increases it, how do we build the schools?
So when you say triples, is that, I assume that's that Embarcadero Institute?
No, I mean, there's no reference to that.
Okay.
It's just
that's
a hypothetical.
A report, a very, I thought, melodramatic report that came out in Palo Alto that SB 50 was, I think, going to triple the population, which assumed that the entire city would be demolished and rebuilt. So that, and the thing about development is it's really slow and gradual, right? So I think, and this is it's one reason why it's hard to take on this issue as a politician, because I have a shelf life, right? At the most, I'll be in the Senate for 12 years. And this is a problem that in terms of actually solving it, I'm going to be out of office, right? This is a long-term project. This isn't going to be solved in a few years. And housing, even if we create the easiest system imaginable to build housing, it's still gradual. You have to have an available parcel of land. You have to have a developer with funding. Nothing is fast. And so for the YIMBYs of the world, people are like, this is frustrating. I want that built yesterday. And for people who are concerned, I think sometimes there's a perception that the bill gets signed and all these apartment buildings like descend from the sky. It's going to be very gradual over time. And so what that means in terms of change in a neighborhood, it's not an overnight thing. It's gradual, for better or for worse. And what that also means is that any strains on infrastructure, like schools, is also going to be gradual over time. But I will also say, with schools and parking and traffic and all the other concerns, our population has been growing by leaps and bounds even as we've built very little housing. Housing is not what drives population growth. Population growth is because people want to live somewhere, and they are willing to sometimes live in overcrowded conditions or live in other kinds of situations or pay out spot. They're here already. So I think that concern, while I understand where it's coming from, I don't think it is as extreme as people sometimes imagine.
On the issue of parking, we're going to have a couple of questions. We've got about 5-7 minutes. Maybe could you explain the relationship between? Well, there's a question about whether and is it possible to legislate that multifamily housing have adequate parking? And so maybe you can explain some of the considerations around how.
Well, it depends what you mean by adequate parking. But so parking is. So high parking requirements can be very problematic for housing because it drives up the cost. I don't know what the cost is in Palo Alto. I know in San Francisco, each parking space adds, last I checked a year or two ago, it was $75,000 to the cost of the unit. I'll bet you it's $100,000 now because costs have escalated. So it dramatically increases the cost of housing. It also reduces the amount of housing because if you're requiring, whether it's 1 or 2 units or parking spots per unit, that's enormous amount of space that could be housing. We see it also around public transportation. When we don't zone for density around transit, and you look at some of the bar bed for cars. And so it's a little bit of a chicken density because so much of it's parking, and then the transit, there's not enough ridership flexibility around parking, and to put a cap on the minimum park there. And if it's an area where parking is absolutely essential, maybe you don't need as much parking, that should be based on the facts and circumstances of the project, and not a mandatory across the board. Every unit of housing built has to have some high threshold of parking, and so that's I think the direction we've been moving in. I know it's a hard issue, and believe me, when I representing the Castro, Noe Valley, Glen Park area where we had tons of transit, it was still thermonuclear war on every project about how much parking was going to be there. So it's true in cities, it's true in the suburbs, it's true everywhere.
Here's a kind of a follow-up maybe to Prop 13. Many older people feel like they can't move out of their homes because when they retire because the tax bill on the new value of the house would be so high. Do you think that represents a meaningful amount of the housing shortage? And what are some of the policies that could mitigate this beyond building more
Yeah,
housing?
I think Prop 13, one of its unintended consequences was people feeling trapped in their homes because you had, and the impetus, not the impetus, the impetus between Prop 13 was anti-tax people trying to obliterate public services in California. The Howard Jarvis people, but the messaging behind Prop 13 was protecting seniors on fixed incomes from property tax spikes. Of course, you can do that without doing an across-the-board thing. There are ways that you can protect people on fixed incomes, people of limited means, by capping their property taxes without capping the property taxes of the Transamerica pyramid in San Francisco. But that's what we did, we capped everything. And so now there are, in an ideal world, if you have a 2,500 square foot home and your kids are gone and you don't really want to do upkeep on that home, you might want to buy a smaller home or maybe get especially you need more accessibility. So maybe you want to buy a condo where there's an elevator and you don't have to deal with the stairs anymore. And people do feel trapped. And we do have there is a provision that not all counties participate in that you can, sell your home and buy another home and transfer your property tax basis if you're above a certain age. But not all counties participate. The California Association of Realtors put a ballot measure on last year to dramatically expand that. They way overreached, and so it caused a big backlash, and it was viewed as an expansion of Prop 13, so it was defeated. But I think there is a way to thread the needle on that to facilitate seniors being able to downsize and not being able to downsize without having their property tax exploded.
So I think I'm almost going to wrap up the Q&A and give everybody a little time to interact. But this is an interesting question to end on. Of all the bills in the last 5 to 10 years that have passed on housing, what are the most successful and unsuccessful, and why?
Well, I would never say unsuccessful because that would criticize a colleague, so I wouldn't do that. So successful, there was a bill, forgive me if I get the number wrong, my colleague from across the bay, Senator Nancy Skinner, who is one of the most kick-ass elected officials I've ever met in my life. She's she was on the Berkeley City Council back in the 80s. She was homeless for a time when she was on city council and was raising her kid in a van for a little while, and someone to put teeth in the Housing Accountability Act. I think it was SB 167, and it's really worked. And so that's been a very successful bill. Senator Bob Wieckowski from the South Bay has authored various ADU laws to put teeth in the ADU law that I think have been quite successful. The SB 35 that I authored, I think it's starting to get going, but we're seeing projects around the state that were stuck for a long time that are now being streamlined and approved. The most visible one, you may have read in the paper, is the Valco project in Cupertino, a dead shopping mall that's going to be turned into 2,400 units of housing, 50%, half of which will be affordable to low-income residents. Some people have criticized that project, saying, because it's also going to be jobs there, and so it'll somehow exacerbate the jobs-housing balance. Of course, traditionally in the Bay Area, that site would have been an office park with no housing. So 2,400 units of housing is approval. So those are a few that have been successful. And then, of course, the Senator Tony Atkins and Senator Jim Bell authored important funding measures for housing a few years ago that are already really yielding a lot of fruit.
Well, so I want to just take a second and allow you guys.
Giraffe.
I just want to thank Senator Wiener for coming down here. Let's give him a big round of applause. A lot of questions.